Okay, so it's 7 o'clock. We're going to enter into our workshop for the half hour, and then promptly at 7:30 start our regular meeting. And for our workshop, our planning consultant, Mr. John Clark, will walk us through the latest on a local law to amend parking requirements in the city of Beacon. Mr. Clark.
Yes. We've talked about this in general terms before, so now there's a draft law on the table, although it hasn't been actually gone very far in the city council. They've had one workshop on it, so.
It was referred.
Yes.
Yeah, it was referred to the planning board, and they have a public hearing scheduled, right, for December 18th.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's
Good.
in, yep. Yeah.
So we've been talking about this for a long time. It started out of the affordable housing measures. And I was suggesting that overdoing parking affects the availability of lower rents and inhibits the number of units you can put on a small parcel because you have to provide a lot of parking spaces. And I noted that cities all over the country, over 200 at last count, have eliminated minimum parking standards. And most just eliminate minimum parking standards altogether and let it become a negotiated thing between the applicant and the planning board. Or they allow the applicant to determine how much parking they think they need for the market they have. And most developers will provide parking because otherwise they won't get financing from banks and they won't have happy tenants. So that's what some cities like Hudson just put in a one-liner in their parking standards saying no more minimums and left it up to the planning board to figure out what to do. Others take the approach that we're suggesting here, which is to turn the minimum standards that we've had into maximum standards. So the idea is instead of bargaining up beyond a number, you bargain down below a number.
Have practical observations come into these discussions? And I'm going to throw out something that I can't empirically, I can't say this is absolutely happening. But my strong sense from walking around town is that when the apartments were finished out in the theater building, near, near Brothers Restaurant, that municipal lot and the street spaces on, was it Van Nydek? Just filled up and have stayed filled up. And so I think there are absolutely going to be apartment developments where if they don't have parking, they're going to consume, parking that's public parking in their vicinity. So, like in that, I'm just based on what you've been saying so far, I'm sort of like favoring let the planning board maybe use discretion on different projects because.
Or that's what allowing maximum parking standards instead of minimum allows, because you can go up to the same line and then you can even go beyond it if you want. The standards are now more like guidelines, maximum guidelines. So it gives planning board ultimate flexibility. Remember, I wasn't here for the theater when it was approved, but as I understand it, it was exempted from all parking by the 1964 exemptions. So you couldn't apply parking there.
I understand that, but I'm just saying that it's an example of a development without parking that was provided, and what was the potential observed impact?
Right.
It glommed up all the parking near it.
Yes. So one thing that the proposed law does is eliminate the 64 exemption. So if you're going to have the ability to bargain, you don't have that sort of cut off your head sort of exception in the rule that allows you to just go to zero.
I thought, I was pretty sure that with the theater building, the issue was there was a variance granted in the 80s that was not time limited. It was not because it wasn't an apartment building in 1964.
I recall something.
I was told they applied for the 64 exemptions, but like I said, I wasn't around when it started.
Something similar to what you remember, David. There was
I recall what David recalls, that there had been an exemption granted to them decades ago.
It was
that not,
there was a variance granted in the 80s, if I recall correctly, for conversion to an apartment building that was not time limited, so it wasn't the 1964.
Okay. So, in the interest of sort of getting through this, let me get through the text as much as possible, and then we'll have a discussion. I'll give you a quick outline of what's being proposed, and you can see it on the screen or on your computer. So it's sort of four things get done in this law. First of all, the word requirement is sort of purged from where it's in there all through it, because that was the purpose of 22326, was to make requirements. And so nothing's required now other than single-family homes, two-family homes, and accessory apartments, because those are often determined by the building inspector. And he doesn't have the discretion that the planning board has, so there's a limit of one per each of those uses. So if you have a single-family, a two-family, or a accessory apartment, you have to have one parking space for any of those type of uses. Two for a two-family, one for one family, and one for an accessory apartment. Other than that, the big change is that the maximum list has been revised slightly, where it's really out of character and needs updating, and also it's turned into maximum rather than minimums. So there's a guidance for the planning board, is this is what was previously required. Now it's considered a maximum rather than a minimum, but you have the ability to bargain down or bargain up depending on the use and the context and the size of the parcel and all the things that a mandatory minimum doesn't take into consideration. And that's why the minimums are so arbitrary, and a good thing to get rid of is because they were based on a use, as if all uses in one category are the same. And whereas some have bigger parcels, some have little parcels, some are out of town, some are in the center, and have public parking available. All those things are now available for the planning board to use. So if you walk through the text, I will go through it quickly. The other thing, the big change, is that the 1964 parking exemption is eliminated, because that seemed so far out of date to try to go back and research what the, and the second paragraph on that two has 187 words in it without a break. One sentence with 187 words. It's really impossible to understand unless you go through it 6 times. So it's nice to get rid of that. So we do have that one exception for single, two-family, and accessory apartments. And instead of 2 per unit, now we have 1 per unit. So that's the minimum. You can, obviously, people, if they want to put 4 in their lot and have room to do so, they can do it. But you have to have at least 1. The other change, there's a few little or smaller changes that were asked by members of the council. They wanted more landscaping, so for at least 1 tree has to be provided for each 8 spaces instead of each 10 spaces.
What's the reference to a corporation council? What is that?
That's the city attorney.
Oh, what's the corporation? The city?
Is that in here, corporation council?
Yeah, it's,
Yeah, that
Some cities refer to
It's City Attorney Corporation Council.
last time I
okay.
I ran into that
the city, that's what the
in
city
New
attorney
Rochelle.
does.
yeah, no, I was just curious. That's you.
The other change that the planning board, or the city council asked for, and this one I want your opinion and the city engineer's opinion in particular, the planning board shall require pervious surfaces for the parking spaces unless the applicant established to the planning board's satisfaction that if the underlying soils do not allow natural drainage. So they want pervious pavement. And there's debates about pervious pavement, how well it holds up, how hard it is to maintain, how more expensive it is, all those sorts of questions are out there, and I don't know I think,
It's not easy to maintain. There's special requirements for maintenance, for vacuuming of it, cleaning it out. It is costly. Yes, it does work in the beginning, but in the Northeast, it does have its failures, especially during the winter months and periods.
I think that we could look at the intention behind the request and, satisfy the intention through bioengineering.
There may be able to do bioretention, landscaped areas. There may be other paver areas that we could do. Once that material clogs up, it's hard to get it cleaned.
Yeah. So you're saying the council is insisting on all pervious
that
material?
was agreed upon by several members to put in the draft. And I said, well, I'll run it by the planning board and the city engineer and see what they thought. I think my preference is to use green infrastructure, rain gardens, instead of having raised curbs, and so that all the pavement drains away from the landscaping and drain it towards the landscaping. Those sorts of things, I think, are more effective.
Could we look at it in terms of design guidelines as opposed to requiring permeable paving so that we can,
Yeah,
There's,
because I think there are instances where permeable paving can be appropriate
Right.
and can be maintained.
Right. And they're basically, they're saying pervious surfaces. So there are other things besides pervious asphalt. There's asphalt pavers or block pavers that you
Yep,
can
turf
use.
block.
Right.
Yep.
So there's
Right.
different things, but I also agree with John that there's other green engineering aspects that can be used, bioretention areas, sloping everything to the
Yeah.
landscaped islands.
So one of the recommendations back to the council might be to make that a little bit more broad.
Yep.
To require green infrastructure, including things like pervious surfaces, to give you a little bit more flexibility
Yeah.
on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, it sounds like the intention is to minimize the amount of water going into the storm
Right.
Yep.
water system.
Right, to minimize
Yeah,
the
and that's
runoff. And
fair.
at least they've couched it with the underlying soils, because there are a lot of areas in the city we have clay
Yeah.
soils. Nothing's going anywheres.
So, so we'll mark that one.
okay. So moving down, and this is the most important part, is this section D.
John, can we go back for a second to that
Sure.
same page? Can I just ask a question? I'm wondering for item number 7 at the bottom of that page where we were talking about the green infrastructure, where this is the shared parking, 2 or more uses on the same lot. And I'm wondering whether we even need that section if we no longer have requirements, minimum requirements per use on the lot. And the planning board is determining what the appropriate amount of parking spaces are for each application that comes before it. That's essentially what this section gets to in the instance where you have required minimums for each use. So I think we should consider whether you even need item number 7.
The whole thing eliminate?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
think it's
took out
probably-
that key sentence
right.
in there.
Is this item 7 revised?
Well, there still is the shared parking section, so it gives a relief from this section. So if you sort of total up the two, and then you can deduct from that based on the shared use analysis. That's the way it works now.
But if we no longer have requirements for the 2, what are you adding up and deducting from? I don't know, something to consider.
Well, it talks about contiguous lots, though, which I think is important. If the owner owns the next lot over and has room for parking and it's needed, you could ask for it.
Could we go back to number 5?
And we're going backwards here, huh?
Yeah, well, the pervious surfaces. So are they expecting this also of a single-family home? And a homeowner is supposed to put in some sort of pervious asphalt or anything?
I think they were probably envisioning more commercial in large residential than single-family homes, but.
It
I mean,
doesn't
you don't
clarify
even-
that. I
You
mean,
don't even
so-
see, the planning board doesn't even see single-family
Residential,
homes
yeah.
for the most part, so,
Yeah, but if we were to have a subdivision,
yeah,
well, we just had one, 12 Highland,
yeah.
you know, are all those homeowners actually going to be able to maintain
Yeah, that's a good
their
point.
drives properly? You know, I can see a commercial entity doing it.
Yeah.
But it's costly. But I don't see the individual homeowner, and it's just going to go by the wayside and fail.
Gravel, which is no fun in the winter when you're plowing.
Right, it's out in the road, you gotta,
You got to rake it back onto your driveway. Okay.
All right, going down to 7 again.
Are you talking about 7 revised or 7 new?
7 at the bottom of 4, page 4.
2 or more uses on the same lot.
Yeah. Got it. Planning board may approve the joint use of parking space by 2 or more establishments on the same lot or on contiguous lots, the total capacity of which is less than the sum of the spaces needed for each.
So it shows that 2 adjacent uses can share parking, or 2 adjacent lots can share parking.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see an issue with that. I think it provides a,
a little clarity, I think.
Yeah, I think it should stay myself, but
Provides a
unless
lever.
you have a good reason why it shouldn't.
One question about the joint adjacent lots would be if that would prevent development. You know, we recently had a project where there was a adjacent lot that was used to get approval for parking, right? And then subsequently it was proposed as a development site, and the city had to accommodate the parking that was provided for it. And since it was a separate lot, there was a whole issue that they had to combine those lots, and that was part of the approval process, and it was a hurdle they had to deal with. So if aren't in control and potentially have a requirement for your site plan that's on an adjacent lot, they potentially could be sold, right?
Well, I think that, I'm not familiar with that, what led up to that. That again was one of those things before my time, so I'm working on sort of half knowledge. But I think it was because they didn't shore it up in a legally constituted easement or some sort of agreement that you could hold the second lot to the long-term deal. That's my understanding, but I don't know if that's true or not. I think we're talking about 344.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that was because it was, it was a lease. So it wasn't something that runs with the land. It wasn't an easement.
Right, but that would be-
Leases can be terminated,
Yeah.
leases can be broken.
Right. But also
But the
adjacent
code allowed
lots.
for that particular mechanism to be one to tie the 2 lots together.
So do we want to make some restriction in this?
Well, I think that might be covered under paragraph B1, where they're providing a binding agreement in a form approved by the Corporation Council.
binding means binding.
Structures, land uses, or more adjoining lots may be provided in a single common facility or facility on one or more of said lots, provided that a binding agreement in a form approved by the Corporation Council assuring the continued operation of said parking facility during the life of the structure or the land use. So
Yeah, there is
I don't know if
provision for that.
there's, right, more that needs to be added to that. I mean, I would defer to Jennifer on that, if there's something else that needs to,
Yeah, I think the term binding agreement would include something like a lease, but I think we've seen that that isn't necessarily, in all instances, the best mechanism.
right, so I don't
And
know if
something
if
more
we need
like
to expand upon
Easements
that.
or deed restrictions would be the better
Right.
terminology there versus binding agreement.
I think that's an appropriate recommendation to make. Forgive me, if we haven't skipped past, or if we haven't gone further than the waiver of improvement, item 2 on the bottom of page 5, that's our mechanism for discussing land banking with an
Yes.
applicant? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed.
Right,
No.
I left that in for sure.
Other than to take the word required out, makes sense. Okay, just, thanks.
So the shared parking provisions and the land banking provisions are still in there, gives you
Yeah.
a lot more flexibility.
Great.
And I think the land banking is one of those things that has proven to be very useful.
Yeah, agreed. Okay.
So getting down to D again. So this is it sets up the list. And it's, the first paragraph is just sort of about purposes that promote walkability and other transportation alternatives to avoid excessive automobile traffic and unnecessarily large paved parking lots. The argument is that by requiring everybody to have parking, free parking, you incentivize the use of automobiles. In fact, you make people auto-dependent because they have to have a space there for them. So why not fill it up? And that when there aren't spaces available, people think of other ways of getting around. And they rent places that don't necessarily have parking because it's convenient and they can get around by other means. So people self-select towards smaller parking areas rather than larger parking areas. That's the theory behind it.
Theory. Yeah, I think that works in, I think that might work in larger communities. But what we've seen in Beacon recently is we really don't have a functioning transit system here. It's a very low capacity, doesn't really work in a way that can be used by anybody who lives downtown or in any dense area where parking is at a premium to get around, to do anything. So I think it's a practical reality that everybody who occupies an apartment or any dense area in Beacon would need a car. And that's going to be the case, even if it's an electric car in the foreseeable future, right? Because I don't think, it's unclear whether there's going to be a consistent dedicated support either by population or by political will to have any sort of a transit system that'll support the idea of not owning a car in Beacon.
Actually, the city's been working with, based on the Main Street Access Committee recommendations, has been working with Dutchess County Transit, and they're on the verge, they're in public comment sections of upgrading the bus system in Beacon, in which you will have a back and forth shuttle on Main Street rather than a big figure-8 loop.
Yeah.
And the other perimeter routes are going to be increased in number and capacity.
But have there been any studies of like what the actual capacity of even a constant loop would be, and whether that would have the capacity or the extent that would allow somebody to go shopping in a place that wasn't Key Foods or do other things, right? That is required to have like a normal life without the use of a car.
That's what the bus is. The bus system is trying to make those improvements. Whether
Right.
they're sufficient for your standards or not, I'm not sure.
But they haven't, there's studies, they can study these things. the
Well, that's
numbers
what they're
that can
doing.
get-
That's the point.
Okay,
They did a bus study, and they've tried to figure out how to improve the bus system in Beacon and elsewhere in the county. And so you should take a look at the new system proposals. They're online at Dutchess County Transit, and maybe comment on those.
I've been taking that bus for 20 years. I know how many people use it and how it's varied over different service, ways they've been serviced, so.
Look, I understand what the rationale overall would be, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, no, I'm done.
It seemed
Yeah,
like you
I heard
were
it.
tapering off. I understand what the overall rationale would be for having a limit on maximum parking spaces. Maybe, say we were in some spread out suburban area in Southern California. During my time on this board and previously on the zoning board, I can think of many examples of people who wanted exemptions or variances from parking minimums. I cannot think of any example during the time I've lived in Beacon of someone building something of private accord and everyone being like, why did you put all this parking in? Like, I cannot think of a single example where we have had a problem that would need to be addressed with a maximum parking requirement.
Well, we have in terms of land bank, we've used land banking in that regard.
I think that
To
goes to
minimize.
management. It has to do with whether if these are dedicated spaces to residents, which often aren't used, they're empty for a lot of the day. There's a lot of ways that shared parking can be more efficient, can be functionally better, right? But you still need the actual parking spaces for the amount of people that live here.
Right, yeah, I don't understand what the rationale would be with saying this is the maximum number of spaces you can have in Beacon, regardless of whether it makes sense to otherwise adjust whether and to what extent we have minimum requirements.
You know, the way I look at it is as a just in case, where you have guidelines for an applicant and for us. In the instance, potentially, who knows, 20 years from now, where somebody says, I want to build more parking, then it says here I can. Or I want to go up to the maximum. I don't see any issue with it, 'cause quite honestly.
John, you're thinking the flip side is that somebody might come to us and say, I'd like to build more units on this parcel, and I can do that with less parking? It might happen, I mean, I don't know.
So I understand your questioning of why we would even have a maximum.
I think it gives you some sort of standard in the code so that you can work off that. If there were no maximums, no minimums, then every application would be a crapshoot. You wouldn't have any idea what would be sort of a acceptable range of parking. And so you've had these minimums for years that people have been working with. So now I've adjusted some of them down significantly because they really were overboard.
Yeah.
You know, that I give you the example of the bar. The current code requires twice as much parking for a bar as a restaurant.
Heck yeah.
So that you're ensured that you have plenty of drivers at bars. That's my favorite. But some of these just don't make sense, so I bargained some of those down.
Yeah.
That were way overboard. But this gives you a sort of a set point. And then you can say, okay, well, that was what we used to consider a minimum. Now let's consider that a maximum and figure is that too much?
I like it for that reason. It's somewhat of a guidepost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the way it's set up, as a guidepost.
But don't you think that also different areas of the city have different
Yeah, exactly.
demands naturally? There's an area of the city that was developed before automobiles were commonly used, right? That land use, the way parcels are made, and the density, and the traffic, and that is all set up to make it difficult to manage automobiles. There are other parts of the city that were built for large-scale parking and automobile use, right? I think that you might think that rather than doing a broad, having the same amount of requirements throughout the city, or no requirements throughout the city, that you tailor that to the types of uses and the potential for transit, let's say, that might occur in different parts of town. That would be wise, that would be a
And we've
zoning
done that to a
aspect.
certain degree over the years because we lowered the parking standards in the CMS district where there's a lot of public parking and we lowered it in the linkage district where you can walk to the train station. And we haven't lowered it in other places like the general business district, which is where you have a lot of big extra parking lots that are half empty or three-quarters empty most of the time.
And in some instances, this revision gives us a little bit more ability to customize, for lack of a better word, based on the application and where it sits within the city, because it's ultimately what we deem somewhat, to some degree, appropriate,
Exactly.
right? So we
And it
have,
gives you more
we have
information.
some agency over that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you go down section D, it lists the sorts of things that you should consider as part of it. So the context of the site matters a lot more under this code than, whereas before, any retail needed the same amount of parking. It defines what a professional parking study is. Gives more examples that it has to have a, what do we call it? Demand reduction strategies. So it incorporates analysis. In the parking analysis, it has to consider whether there's walkability in that area, whether there's bicycling proposed for the site, bike storage or whatever else, whether it's on a transit line. All those things now have to be incorporated into a traffic and parking study. Whereas now, it's basically all about, and they mention things like pedestrian system, but they don't account for them in the traffic study because they want to be as conservative as possible to provide as many parking spaces as they possibly can. And this gives you the incentive to say, no, if this is in an area where there's plenty of public parking and street parking and transit services, we don't need as much parking on the site. And you can put more housing there instead, for instance.
So the judgment of how much parking ought to be with the discretion that the board would have, right, would be somewhat dependent upon our consultants having a discussion with an applicant's consultants, right? Much like happens in some of our other ones, which can be a long and drawn-out process, right? And sometimes it's opaque to the public because they're discussing numbers, like traffic studies aren't something that normal people are going to start drilling down to see whether or not it makes sense, right? They're just working on the general top-level recommendations of someone that we hire for however many months it takes, and the applicant, and it might be dependent upon whether the applicant's consultant has a more robust support system, a more persuasive way to argue it, you know. So I don't know if that's the simplest way to resolve it. I'm wondering whether that's the simplest way or whether it's adds a level of complexity and uncertainty, right?
Yeah, well, and I'll just throw in, I mean, another observation, there's absolutely nothing in here that, by my reading, requires, we've got this list of things that the planning board is supposed to consider in determining the appropriate number of parking spots. One of them is a parking study prepared by the applicant. While it's an including but not limited to list, the next paragraph is talking about any professional parking study requested by the planning board, which at least inferentially says that's not actually part of our decision-making process. At most, it would be
They're
we'd
tools.
hire a consultant and they'd talk to the consultant hired by the applicant.
Not necessarily.
No, it works the way, same
If I
way it
was
does
gonna make-
now, is that for any major project that has traffic or parking implications, we ask for a traffic or parking study.
Yep.
And for any major project that involves traffic, we have our own traffic. So it would be the same as what you do right now for minor projects, for change of uses, for things that don't have a big parking implication. You can make your own determination,
I
but
find
if you have the right under this to request a professional parking study for any major project in which there are complexities.
And I find those very useful
And
tools for the board.
if you hire the right consultant, you will get a good product out of it.
Correct, but so this actually goes to, if you were asking me what changes we should be making to this current structure, the current structure, meaning the status quo, where we have parking minimums, and then we have provisions in place that say the planning board can approve alternative parking arrangements based on parking studies. The number one change I'd say is it should be our consultant that is preparing the parking study. You give us your plans, we will tell you how many parking spots you need. Not a situation where the applicant is preparing the study and our consultants are essentially coming in and giving us a judgment on whether it was reasonably prepared, not this is how I would have prepared it myself. So now we're saying we get rid of the minimums, meaning the solid guideposts that we're starting out with, and it's just dependent on what the applicant's
No.
study says.
No, not at all. That's not, it would not, the ability to, and I see what you're saying, but number one, it's incumbent upon the applicant to, one, come to us with what they reasonably think is an appropriate parking scenario. And as a part of that, it makes total sense for them to support that with a parking analysis paid for by the applicant. Where we have the ability to engage our consultant to either confirm or poke holes in that, that's a very useful tool. And it's a conversation that consultants have been having on applicants for time immemorial. So it's very much how we do it now, and it's a very useful set of mechanisms, tools, to ultimately supporting the record for a thorough planning board review for what ultimately is a very public process of determining the appropriate amount of parking.
And I just want to mention too, it's not just the conclusion that's vetted by our, traffic and parking consultant, it's also the methodology. So whenever there needs to be a change in the methodology that the applicant's consultant has used in order to come up with the conclusion, our consultant weighs in on that as well.
Right.
And make sure that they're satisfied not just with the conclusion, but the methodology that was used to get to the conclusion, including the inputs and all the data.
Right.
So
that
we're-
goes
we're
into
at-
That's
getting to-
opaque. That's
We're at
opaque to the
time. I
public.
just want to,
Yeah.
we're running over. So unless there are other specific,
Well, I think we have to pick this up at
modifications.
the end of the meeting.
sorry?
I
We're
think
gonna
we're
pick
going
it
to have
up.
to pick this up at the end of the meeting.
Yeah. So then to that end, we'll do just that.